Right now in our application, there's actually a bit of an issue. If we ever refresh our application, whether because we updated our code, or let's say, for example, in a live setting, if our user refreshes the page, they'll actually lose everything they have in their store, including their cart items. So if we were to refresh, our reducer gets reset completely, which makes a lot of sense because our application is reinstantiating and all of our initial states for all our reducers are being loaded. So it's like the app is in a brand new state. The only reason the user is being set is because our user's authentication status is not being stored by the application. It's being handled by Firebase Auth, if you remember when we did that lesson. So Firebase Auth gives us session persistence because it's aware of until when the user signs out, it's not going to actually end the session. Whereas for everything else in our store, we don't have any kind of storage of anything related in order to persist the state of the cart items that we're adding across our application, even on refresh or closing the window. Now, we want to fix this because in most e-commerce websites, it persists the user's cart in some way, shape, or form. If not when the user closes and reopens the website, at least if the user refreshes in the same session, in the same tab. Now, there's multiple ways that we can tackle this problem. One way is using Firebase, where we would store our cart items, and then they would belong to our user, so that whenever the user signs in, or whenever we're aware that a user auth state has changed, based on our app.js's user ref on snapshot getting fired, we could also pull in our cart, which we would store in our database. But we're going to do that actually later on in the course in a more advanced Firebase lesson. But right now, what if we just wanted to leverage what we had on the front end? What if we wanted to just store our cart items? Well, if you're familiar with local storage, it's actually possible. And the reason why it's possible is because our reducer state is pretty much just JSON objects. They're just large JSON objects, which is easy to store and easy to update, especially because our reducers are just functions that return object states, right? So it's really easy, you can imagine, if in some way we could store the state of what the reducer is in, and then when the app reloads, we just pull in whatever we stored and then populate the reducer as such. Now, there's a really easy library called Redux Persist that allows us to do exactly that, and it wires in with Redux so that we don't actually have to worry that much about it. But before we explore that, I want to talk about local storage because that's what the underlying tool is being used by Redux Persist. So let's actually explore local storage a little bit. And it's pretty easy to actually start using. So we actually have access to it on our window object. So on our window object, we have access to both local storage and session storage, which are both the almost exact same means of storing something on our browser. The only difference is that session storage persists it throughout the session. So as long as our tab is open, even if we refresh the page, we'll still have access to what we've stored in session storage. Whereas if we close the page, then we would lose whatever it is that we stored in session storage. Whereas local storage will persist until we clear it out, meaning that if we close our window, close our browser, we'll always have access to it. But let's actually explore how to use it. Now, local storage has a get item and a set item. So one sets the item inside the storage, so it stores it, and then the get lets us pull it out of local storage. And we store them under string keys, right? So we give it a key, and that's what it'll store it under, and it'll also be the same key that we use to access it. But we have to store strings only. So let's say, for example, that we had a object we wanted to store, my object to store. And it's just equal to some object with my name of Yihua on it. Now, in order for me to store it, I would say window.localstorage.setItem, right? And then I would give it the key. So let's say my item. Now, what I want to do in order to actually store it is I have to convert this JSON object to a string. And we can do that with the JSON object that we get from our JavaScript. So we always have access to this. And this allows us to perform certain methods on our JSON objects, such as this one called stringify, which allows us to stringify our object. And all it does is it wraps this object inside of a string. And it converts all the keys also to strings, right? Which is required for JSON. So we'll say JSON stringify my object to store. And now window.localstorage has stored it. If we want to access it again, we'll just call window.localstorage.getItem and we'll say my item. And there we see that's our object, but stored as the string, right? Because we stringified it, and that's what it looks like. If we wanted to convert it back, we can just set a new object to my retrieved object. And let's say we just call it our window.localstorage.getItem, right? So we want to get it under our key that we set it under. And then now let's say we wanted to turn it into our string. Well, we would say json.parse, right, which is a method on that same JSON object we were talking about. And let's say we do my retrieved object. Well, now we get our object back. So really handy, right? Local storage is great for this. If I refresh, I'll see that I still have access to local storage. And now if I look, there's the string. We can just parse it again. And now I've managed to persist this object across my application state. It's persisted. So because all we're storing are JSON objects, wouldn't it be great if we could just store the state of our cart and then persist it, and then whenever our application refreshes or opens up for the first time, we pull it out of local storage and then update our reducer to show what we had stored? Well, that's what the library Redux persist does. But I wanted to show you what local storage was and session storage. Session storage is almost the identical to local storage. But again, it just doesn't store across closing the tab. But I just wanted to show you what's happening under the hood with this library we're to bring in of Redux persist. So we learned about the Redux persist library in the last lesson. But now we are actually going to implement and use it inside of our application. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to bring the Redux persist library into our application. And we simply do it by saying yarn add Redux persist. Now, Redux persist is really cool because it lets us leverage either local storage or session storage very easily from the package we just installed. And it's got a little bit of some setup and configuration that we have to do, but it's nothing too daunting. All we need to do is we need to go to our store.js file and make some modifications. So right now, all we're exporting out is our store. And as you remember, it is just a combination of our root reducer and our middlewares. Now what we're going to do is we're also going to import in our new Redux persist, bringing in the persist store function from Redux persist. Now, what this does is it allows our browser to actually cache our store now, depending on certain configuration options that we're going to set. But all you need to understand first inside of this store.js is that we're bringing in this persist store. And what we're doing is we're exporting the store out, but we're also going to export out this new thing called a persister. And all this thing does is it calls our persist store, passing in our store. So this persister is essentially a persisted version of our store. And using this and our store is how we will actually create our new provider that's wrapping our application. If that sounds confusing, don't worry. It'll make more sense once we actually write all the code. But all we're doing here in our store is we're creating this new persisted version of our store, right? Using this persister object. Now that we have this, as far as our export default goes, we're just going to return an object, right? That gives both the store and the persister. Now we'll actually have access to both of these things if we need it, but we actually won't really use it, but it's just good for us to write it in case we ever want it. Now that we have our store.js updated, we need to actually update our root reducer. Inside of our root reducer, we're going to import in persist reducer because we persisted our store before, but now we want to persist our reducer. So we're going to import persist reducer from Redux persist. And we're going to also import in the type of storage we want. If we say import storage from Redux persist /lib/storage, what we'll get here is the actual local storage object on our window browser. So this is essentially telling Redux persist, I want to use local storage as my default storage. Alternatively, you can also import session storage, which is from a different package link. So these are just representative of the folders that we need to go into in order to get session storage. I can't remember off the top of my head what the actual session storage library is, but you can find it very easily inside of the Redux persist docs that I have linked in the resources. But what we want to use is just the regular storage. So this is perfectly fine for us. And what we do with this is we have to define a new persist config. So this is pretty much just the JSON object that represents the possible configurations that we want for Redux persist to use. As I mentioned, it's just an object, and we need to tell it the key. So our key is root, essentially meaning at what point inside of our reducer object do we want to start storing everything. And we want to start from the root. Then we want to pass storage in as storage. So this will say the storage key goes to whatever the storage object from Redux persist we're trying to use is. And then finally, we can pass in this whitelist property. And this property is an array containing the string names of any of the reducers that we want to store. So here we have two, user and cart. But of course, our user is being handled by Firebase authentication. So there's no reason for us to actually persist this. Instead, all we want to persist is the cart. So we're just going to pass in a string that says cart, which lets Redux persist know that the only thing we want to whitelist, i.e. the only reducer that we actually want to persist, is the cart. Now, if in the future we added more and more reducers to our combine reducers call, and we wanted to actually persist them as well, we would just throw the new key in after our cart inside of this whitelist array. So it's very simple, just like that. Now, I know there was a couple configuration things we had to do, which might seem a little odd, but this is really just how we have to use it. After this, what we need to do is we have to actually call this our root reducer, because we have to wrap this inside of our new persist reducer call. What we were exporting before, we're now setting as this root reducer. And what we're going to export as the default instead is calling this persist reducer as a function, passing in both our persist config as well as our root reducer. So this will return back out of this function now, and what we're exporting by default as well, this modified version of our root reducer with this persist config on top of it. So it's a modified version of our root reducer, except now with persistence capabilities, thanks to this persist reducer function that we got from Redux persist. Finally, inside of our index.js, we just need to now actually bring in the actual persister that we need, as well as the component that will leverage inside of our application that will give it the context of our new persisted reducer. So what we need to do is import in this new component called persistgate from Redux persist /integration/React. Of course, Redux persist, you might be wondering, why is there a React integration? Well, this is because you can actually use this with multiple different platforms. Redux persist exists for any platform that might leverage Redux, including React Native and Electron. Those have their own separate files that we need to import different things for. This one is specific for us with React. So with the persist gate, we need to actually bring in our new persister as well as the store. So from our Redux store, we just need to make sure that we're also bringing in our persister. And then we're going to wrap our app inside of this persist gate, where we now pass into the persist gate the persister that we wrote inside of our Redux store. The persister being the persisted version of our store. Now, we want to make sure to wrap our app in this persist gate, because what we want to do is have our application always have access to the persistence flow itself. What this will do is it'll allow the persist gate to actually, one, receive the store, but also fire off actions that will rehydrate the state whenever our application refreshes. So here we'll see, when we go back to our application, that you'll see that this is actually still there from whenever I added it earlier. So let's add more items in, go to our checkout, and now when I refresh, you'll see that this is still there. And the reason why is because of these actions that are firing. This first persist action coming from the persist library is checking whether or not anything exists. And then if it does, it will fire off this new action that will say, hey, I want to rehydrate the state with whatever it is that we've stored inside of our preferred means of storage. And here we'll see that before, our cart was simply just the empty initial state we had. And after the rehydrate state, our cart is updated with the things that we wanted to update with. So this is really great for us because now we're finally able to actually maintain cart state of our cart items across sessions. So this is a great thing about Redux persist and Redux as a whole. It lets us leverage local storage in order to gain access to this powerful feature of being able to persist our application state across sessions and across tabs. So this is a great feature for us, and it's really necessary in an e-commerce platform. And I know there was quite a bit of configuration here that we had to write, but this is simply all we need to do just to use it. Now, of course, if you want to see what other configurations you can add for your own needs in the future when you join any team with an application that's using Redux, you can always look at the docs that I've linked in your resources. So let's move on with our next lesson.